The little old kitchen had quieted down from the bustle and confusion of midday. It was just on the edge of twilight, and the little Peppers, all except Ben, the oldest of the flock, were taking a breathing spell, as their mother called it. Times were always hard with them nowadays, and since the father died when Phronsie was a baby, Mrs. Pepper had hard work to scrape together money enough to put bread into her children's mouths. But with a stout heart she worked away, day after day, at tailoring and mending, and she had seen with pride her noisy, happy brood growing up around her, making the little brown house fairly ring with jollity and fun. To help Mother was the great ambition of all the children, but in Polly's and Ben's souls the desire grew so overwhelmingly great as to absorb all lesser things. Polly was 10, and Ben 1 year older, and the younger 3 of the 5 little Peppers looked up to them with the intensest admiration and love. What they failed to do couldn't very well be done by anyone. "Oh, dear," exclaimed Polly, as she sat helping her mother pull out basting threads from a coat. "I do wish we could ever have any light, just as much as we want." "You don't need any light to see these threads," said Mrs. Pepper, winding up hers carefully on an old spool as she spoke. "Now take care, Polly, you broke that. Thread's dear now." "Everything's dear now," said Polly vexedly. "I wish we could have, ever and ever so many candles, as many as we wanted. I'd light 'em all, and have it light here one night anyway." "How many'd you have, Polly?" asked Joel curiously. 200, said Polly. Little Davy drew a long sigh. "Wouldn't it cost money, though?" "I don't care," said Polly, giving a flounce in her chair, which snapped another thread. "Would they burn?" asked Phronsie anxiously. "Burn?" said Polly. "I guess they would, Phronsie, pet." And Polly caught up the little girl and spun round and round the old kitchen till they were both glad to stop. "Then," said Phronsie, "I do so wish we might, Polly." And Phronsie clasped her fat little hands in rapture at the thought. "Oh, dear me," said Polly, "here's Ben." For the door opened, and Phronsie, with a scream of delight, bounded into Ben's arms. "Sometime," said Phronsie, when the meal was nearly over, "we are going to be awfully rich." "We are, Ben, truly." "No," said Ben, "you don't say so, chick." After the supper was over and the table had been pushed back against the wall, Ben cast a sorrowful glance at Polly. "I wish we could be rich right now," he said, "in time for Mamsie's birthday tomorrow." "Oh, I know," cried Polly. "I know the very thing, Ben. Let's make her a cake." "She'll see you bake it," said Ben. "No, she won't either," replied Polly. "Don't you know she's going to help Mrs. Henderson tomorrow? Why, we can have it all out of the way perfectly splendid when she comes home." "Polly," and Ben stopped, unwilling to dampen her spirits. "The stove will act up like anything tomorrow. I know it will. And then what'll you do?" "It shan't," said Polly, running up to look at it in the face. "If it does, I'll shake it." And so the minute her mother had departed for the minister's house next morning, and Ben had gone off to his day's work chopping wood for Deacon Blodgett, Polly assembled her forces around the old stove. "Oh, dear," said Polly, "there goes Ben's putty. It's all fallen out." "So it has," said Joel, going around back of the stove to explore. And then he added cheerfully, "It's an awful big hole, Polly." "I shall have to stuff it with paper, I suppose." "Won't stay in," said Joel scornfully. "Don't you know you stuffed it before last week?" "Well, now, children," said Polly, turning around impressively upon them, "we must have something to stop up that hole." "I know," cried Davy, and without another word he flew out of the room, and the next minute he put into Polly's hand an old leather boot top, one of his most treasured possessions. "You can chip it real fine," he said, "and then it'll go in." And so, with the united efforts of the 2 boys, the leather was crammed into place, and the fire began to burn. "And now," said Polly, after they had all sat around the stove another half hour, watching and sniffing expectantly, "the cake's done." And quick as a wink, Polly twitched it out and set it on the table. But, oh dear, of all the things in the world, the beautiful cake, over which so many hopes had been formed, presented a forlorn appearance as it stood there. It was quite black on the top, in the center of which was a depressing little dump. "Now," said Polly, looking at the stove, "I hope you're satisfied." And without a bit of warning, she sat right down in the middle of the floor and began to cry as hard as she could. "Well, I never," said a cheery voice. "It's Mrs. Beebe," cried Davy. "See, Polly?" Polly scrambled up to her feet to greet the kindly neighbor, and the others explained to their new visitor the sad disappointment that had befallen them. "You poor creatures, you," she exclaimed at last for about the 50th time. "Here, Polly, here's some flowers for you." "Oh," cried Polly with a radiant face, "why, Mrs. Beebe, we can put them in here, can't we?" And she set the little knot of flowers in the hollow of the cake, and there they stood and nodded away to the delighted children. How surprised their mother appeared that evening when she was ushered out to the feast and the full glory of the table burst upon her. Her delight in the flower-covered cake was fully enough to satisfy the most exacting mind. Mrs. Pepper's eyes glistened with delight at the noisy troop around her. "I don't want any other celebration," she said, "than to look round on all of you." One day, a few weeks after, Mrs. Pepper and Polly were busy in the kitchen. Phronsie was out in the orchard singing her rag doll to sleep. But Baby was cross and wouldn't go to sleep, and Phronsie was on the point of giving up when a strain of music made her pause. "Oh, Phronsie," screamed Polly from the back door, "come here quick. It's a monkey, the sweetest little monkey you ever saw." A man with an organ was standing in the middle of the road, and at the end of a long rope was a lively little monkey with a bright red coat and a smart cocked hat. The man pulled the string and struck up a merry tune, and in a minute the monkey spun around and around at such a lively pace and put in so many queer antics that the little audience was fairly convulsed with laughter. "I can't pay you," said Mrs. Pepper, wiping her eyes, "but I'll give you something to eat." The man looked very cross when she brought him out only brown bread and 2 cold potatoes. "It's as good as we have," said Mrs. Pepper. And then they moved on, and Mrs. Pepper and Polly went back to their work in the kitchen. A little down the road the man struck up another tune. Phronsie, who had started merrily back to tell Baby all about it, stopped a minute to hear, and then didn't go back to the orchard at all. And about 2 hours later Polly said merrily, "I'm going to call Phronsie in, Mammy." But Baby lay on its face disconsolately on the ground, and the orchard was empty. Phronsie was gone. Everybody soon knew that little Phronsie Pepper had gone off with a cross organ man and an awful monkey, and in the course of an hour dozens of people were out on the hot, dusty roads in search. To Ben, who borrowed Deacon Blodgett's horse and wagon and was looking along the Hingham Road, the minutes seemed like hours. The hot sun poured down on the boy's face. Deacon Blodgett's horse began to lag, when suddenly Ben roared, "Whoa!" so loudly the horse nearly flung him headlong. He was over the wheel in a twinkling and up with a bound to a small thicket by the roadside. Here lay a little bundle on the ground, and close by it a big black dog, and over the whole, standing guard, was a boy a little bigger than Ben, with honest gray eyes. And the bundle was Phronsie. "She's my sister," cried Ben. "Our Phronsie." "I know it," said the boy kindly, "but I wouldn't wake her up yet if I were you." "It's all right, Prince," the boy added to the big dog, who had turned his 2 big eyes steadily on Ben. And then, flinging himself down on the grass, the boy told Ben how he had come to rescue Phronsie. "Prince and I were out for a stroll," he said. "All of a sudden I saw a man with an organ and a monkey and a little girl coming along the road. She was crying, and then she broke away from him and ran toward me screaming, 'I want Polly.' Well, the man sprang after her, and then I tell you we went for him, Prince and I." "Was Phronsie frightened?" asked Ben. "Not a bit," said the boy cheerily. "I only wish she was my sister." "Well," said Ben as the boy finished and fastened his bright eyes on him, "I must get her home about as fast as I can, for poor Mammy and Polly, and I want to say thank you." "I know," laughed the boy, "only it's Prince instead of me. We're coming to see you sometime, if you will let us. Where do you live?" "Do come," said Ben. Anybody'll tell you where Mrs. Pepper lives." "Is she a Pepper?" asked the boy, pointing to the unconscious little heap in the wagon. "And are you a Pepper?" "Yes," said Ben, "and there are 5 of us besides Mother." And then away home. Phronsie never woke up nor turned over once until she was put, a little pink, sleepy heap, into her mother's arms. The next day Ben was out by the wood pile trying to break up some kindlings for Polly, who was preparing for the delights of baking day. "Hello," said a voice he thought he knew. He turned around to see the merry-faced boy and the big black dog. "Oh, you've really come," cried Ben. "Polly!" But Polly was already by the door. "This is my sister Polly." "I'm Jasper King," said the boy, taking off his cap. "And this is Prince." "Oh, I must get Phronsie," Polly said, running back into the bedroom, where that small damsel was busily engaged in washing Baby. "Here she is," cried Jasper, meeting her at the door. The little soapy hands were grasped and kissing her. "Ugh," he said, as the soft soap plentifully spread on her face met his mouth. "She's been washing Baby," exclaimed Polly, and they all burst into a peal of laughter. They had received a reinforcement in the advent of Joel and David, who stared delightedly at Phronsie's protector, made friends with the dog, and altogether had such a thoroughly good time that the 5 little Peppers felt they had known Jasper King for a year. "Oh, I should think you have real good times here," said the boy enviously. "You come out some day," said Polly, "and we'll all try baking." "I will," cried Jasper. "You can't think how awfully dull it is out in Hingham." "Don't you live there?" asked Polly. "Live there?" cried Jasper. "No, indeed. We're only spending the summer there, Father and I, in the hotel." "Where's your mother?" asked Joel. "I don't have any mother," said the boy. They all stood quite still for a moment. Then Polly said, "I wish you'd come out sometime, and you can bake or anything else." "Well," said Jasper at last, looking up at the old clock, "I'm afraid I'll miss the stage, and then Father never will let me come again. Come, Prince." "Come on Thursday," said Polly. "We'll bake something." "Oh, I'll come," laughed Jasper. "Look out for me on Thursday, Ben." But Jasper didn't come. Thursday came and went, but with no signs of the merry boy nor the big black dog. At last Polly had to put Phronsie to bed, who wouldn't stop crying long enough to eat her supper. The next morning, Ben had to go to the store after some meal. As he was going out rather dismally, the storekeeper, who was also postmaster, called out, "Oh, hello there. You've got a sister Polly, haven't you?" "Yes," said Ben, wondering what was coming next. "Well, she's got a letter." "Why, it can't be for her, Mr. Atkins. Why, she's never had one." "Well, she's got one now," said Mr. Atkins. "If you say so," said Ben, "but I'm afraid it isn't for Polly." Then, buttoning up the precious letter in his jacket, he spun along home as never before. "Polly!" he screamed. "Where is she, Mother?" "Why, I don't know," said Mrs. Pepper, coming out of the bedroom. "Is anybody hurt, Ben?" "I don't know," said Ben, in a state to believe anything, "but Polly's got a letter." And then the kitchen was in an uproar as the precious missive was put into Polly's hand, and they all gathered around her, wondering and exclaiming, till Ben thought he would go wild with the delay. But at last it was cut, and they all, holding their breath, gazed awestruck while Polly drew out the mysterious missive. "Dear Miss Polly," it said, "I was so sorry I couldn't come on Thursday." "Oh, it's Jasper!" cried all the children in a breath. "But my father was sick, and I couldn't leave him. If you don't mind, I'll come again. I mean I'll come some other day if it's just as convenient for you. Give my love to all, and especially remember me respectfully to your mother. Your friend, Jasper Elliott King." "Oh, lovely!" cried Polly. "So he's coming really and truly." "And now I'll tell you what," said Polly the next day. "Let's make Jasper something. Some little cakes. Real cakes, I mean. Now don't say no, Mamsie." "But we haven't any white flour, Polly," began her mother. "I know," said Polly, "but we'll make 'em of brown." Well, then, said Phronsie, coming up to see Polly measure out the flour, I am going to bake something for my sick man. What did she say, Polly? Asked Joel. She said she was going to bake something for Jasper, said Polly. No, I didn't say Jasper. I guess she means Prince, said Joel. No, I don't mean Prince. I mean my sick man. It's Jasper's father, I guess she means, said Mrs. Pepper. But what in the world? What do you want to bake, Phronsie? Polly asked. A gingerbread boy, said Phronsie, and she commenced to climb up to active preparations. Mamsie, said Polly, we can't let her make a dreadful, horrid gingerbread boy to send Mr. King. Why, he'll never let Jasper come here again. Well, Polly, said her mother, laughing, it's best, I think, to let her. It can't do any harm, anyway. When the little cakes were done and set upon the table for exhibition, they one and all protested that they had never seen so fine a lot. But my gingerbread boy, said Phronsie, is the most beautiful, isn't it, Polly? He looks as if he'd been struck by lightning, said Ben. But Polly packed the little cakes neatly into 2 rows and laid the gingerbread boy in a fascinating attitude across the top. And at last the package was off, and with intense satisfaction the children watched Ben disappear with it down the long hill to the post office. One morning 3 days later, as Ben was turning in at the little brown gate, a voice called, "Oh, Ben!" "Hello," cried Ben, turning around and viewing Jasper and Prince with great satisfaction. "Here I am," said Jasper, his eyes brimful of gladness. "The cakes were awfully good." "Did you like them?" asked Ben, the color up all over his brown face. "Was your father angry about the gingerbread boy?" "No, indeed he wasn't," said Jasper. "Why, I never heard him laugh as he did then. And he says he's coming to see the little girl that baked it for him before we go home." "Coming to see us?" Ben gasped. "Yes," said Jasper, who had scarcely gotten over his own astonishment about it. For nothing could have amazed him more than to hear his father say cheerily, as he pointed to the wild-looking gingerbread boy, "Well, Jasper, I shall have to drive over and see your little girl." And then they had the baking, and Jasper developed such a taste for cookery and had so many splendid improvements that the children thought it the most fortunate thing in the world that he had come. "You know you could cook a Thanksgiving dinner in this stove," said Jasper. "No, you couldn't," said Ben. "Why, Ben Pepper!" exclaimed Jasper. "I should like to know why not." "Because there isn't anything to cook," said Ben, coolly, cutting out a piece of dough. "We don't have Thanksgiving." "Not have Thanksgiving? Well," said Jasper, "I'll tell you what I think you should do. Try Christmas." "We never had Christmas," said little Davy. "What are they like, Jasper?" Jasper sat quite still and didn't reply to the question for a moment or two. To be among children who didn't like Thanksgiving and who didn't know what it was like to have Christmas was a revelation to him. But when they parted that day, Jasper and the little Peppers were sworn friends. And the boy, happy in his good times in the cheery little home, felt the hours long between his visits. And then one day in the last of September, a carriage, drawn by a pair of handsome horses, stopped at the gate of the little brown house. "Goodness me," exclaimed Mrs. Pepper, "here comes Jasper's father, I do believe." A tall, portly gentleman, leaning on a heavy gold cane, was walking up from the little brown gate. Jasper and Prince followed him. "Is your mother in?" asked the old gentleman, who was so tall he could scarcely enter the low door. And then Mrs. Pepper came forward, and Jasper introduced her, and the old gentleman bowed and sat down in the seat Polly placed for him, and Mrs. Pepper thanked him with a heart overflowing with gratitude for all that Jasper had done for them. And then Phronsie, forgetting all else but her poor sick man, rushed out from the bedroom, and coming up to the stately old gentleman in the chair, looked up pityingly and said, "Poor sick man." After that there was no more gravity and ceremony. In a moment Phronsie was perched upon old Mr. King's knee, and the others, freed from all restraint, were chatting and laughing happily, till some of the cheeriness overflowed and warmed the heart of the old gentleman, and it seemed impossible to him that he had been there almost an hour. "We go tomorrow," he said, rising and looking at his watch. This was a blow they little expected. They had surely thought Jasper was to stay a week longer. "Well, all right," said Jasper, not liking to look at Polly just then, as he was sure he wouldn't want anyone to look at him if he felt like crying. "And Jasper," said Joel, "do come next summer." The children crowded back their tears and hastily said their last goodbye, and then the carriage door shut with a bang, and they were gone. But the letters came, and that was a comfort. And full of anticipations of Christmas himself, Jasper urged the little Peppers to try for one. And the life and the spirit of the letter was so catching that Polly and Ben found their souls fired within them to try at least to get for the little ones a taste of Christmas-tide. To their utter surprise, Mrs. Pepper seemed mildly assenting. You see, Mrs. Pepper had received a letter from Jasper, which at present she didn't feel called upon to say anything about. "Wouldn't it be grand to have a tree, Polly?" said Ben. "I can get one easy in the woods, you know. And if we should pop a lot of corn and string it, we could wind it in and out among the branches." "Why, wouldn't that be pretty?" cried Polly. "And then," Ben continued, "there's some little candle ends in that box in the provision room." "And I'll tell you another thing, Ben," Polly said. "You must get ever so many hickory nuts. And you know those bits of bright paper I've got in the bureau drawer? Well, we can paste them onto the nuts and hang them on for the balls Jasper tells us of." "Polly," said Ben, "it'll be such a Christmas tree as never was." Such a contriving and racking of brains as Polly and Ben set up after this. The tree was to be put in the provision room, as the rickety shed attached to the main house was called. "I'll find the key," said Mrs. Pepper, "and then we can keep the children out." And so the weeks flew by, till only 3 days remained, and the house was turned upside down for Joel to find the biggest stocking he could, and the children asked countless questions about Santa Claus and how he could possibly get down the chimney, and Davy ran his head up as far as he dared to see if it was big enough. "We'll never get through this day," said Polly, in despair as the last one arrived. "I wish it was tonight, because we're all ready." There was such a prevailing excitement that no one went to bed on time on Christmas Eve. The result of it was that the children slept over when Christmas morning really did come, and Polly had to go to the foot of the stairs and call, "Merry Christmas! Oh, Phronsie and Joel and Davy!" With smothered whoops of expectation, they one and all flew into their clothes. "Dear, dear," said Polly, pinching Ben to keep him still, as the two of them tumbled down the little rickety stairs to the provision room for a last look at the tree before the children came in. "Isn't it elegant?" Polly asked, going all around and around the tree, magnificent in its dress of bright red and yellow balls and white festoons and little candle ends all ready for the lighting. "Mammy says she'd rather do the lighting up," said Polly. "Had she?" said Ben in surprise. "Oh, I suppose she's afraid we'll set something on fire." "I can't bear to go," said Polly, turning reluctantly away. "Oh, Ben, is your Santa Claus dress all safe?" "Yes," said Ben. "I'll warrant they won't find that one in a hurry." "Polly!" rang a voice dangerously near, so that Polly, speeding out to intercept it, nearly fell on her nose. "Where have you been?" asked Davy. "Let's have a concert," said Ben. "Come on now, we'll march around and see which one can make the biggest noise." But all this time, Mrs. Pepper had been pretty busy in her way. And now she came into the kitchen, and, "Children," she said. Everyone turned and looked at her. Her tone was so strange. "You may all come into the provision room." Polly flew around like a general arranging her forces. "Let's march there," she said. So down the stairs they went with military step and into the provision room. And then with one wild look, the little battalion broke ranks and tumbled one over the other in a decidedly unmilitary style. And Captain Polly was the most unmilitary of all, because she gave one gaze at the tree and then sat right down on the floor and said, "Oh, my." "It's fairyland," cried little Davy, out of his wits with joy. "Aren't we in fairyland, Ma?" But Mrs. Pepper just said, "Santa Claus is coming." A rattle at the little old window made everybody look there, just as a great snow-white head popped up over the sill. In jumped a little old man with a jolly red face and a pack on his back, prepared to do his duty. But first he flew up to Mrs. Pepper and said, "Oh, Mamsie, how did you do it?" "It's Ben!" screamed Phronsie. And then it all came out. Mrs. Pepper handed Santa a letter to read, and the jolly old saint piped out in Ben's loudest tones, "Dear friends, a Merry Christmas to you all, and that you'll have a good time and enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed my good times at your house, is the wish of your friend, Jasper Elliott King." "Hurrah for Jasper," said Santa Claus, pulling his beard. "Now do your duty, Santa Claus," said Mrs. Pepper, and everything was as still as a mouse. And the first thing she knew, a lovely brass cage with a dear little bird with 2 astonished black eyes in it was put into Polly's hands. The card on it said, "For Miss Polly Pepper, to give her music every day in the year." And then that wonderful tree just rained down all manner of lovely fruit. A shawl flew down on Mrs. Pepper's shoulders. A work-basket tumbled on Polly's head, and tops and balls and fishing poles sent Joel and David into a corner with howls of delight. But the climax was reached when a large wax doll with a very gay pink silk dress was put into Phronsie's hands, and Ben, stooping down, read in loud tones, "For Phronsie, from one who enjoyed her gingerbread boy." And here Joel had the last word. "You said it wasn't going to be Christmas always, Mamsie." "I say," he said, looking around at the overflow of treasures and the happy faces, "it'll be just forever." And now the letters flew thick and fast from the city to the little brown house and back again, warming Jasper's heart and filling the tedious months of that winter with more jollity and fun than the lad had ever enjoyed before. But the boy was looking forward to summer more than anything. Alas for Jasper, as spring advanced, his father took a decided aversion to Hingham and all other places that could be mentioned in that vicinity. No use to urge to the contrary. All Jasper's pleadings were in vain. At last his sister Marian, who was kind-hearted to a fault, said one day, "Well, why not have the children come here? I should like it very much. Invite Ben." "I don't want Ben," said Jasper gloomily. "I want Polly." "Very well, then," said his sister. "I should prefer Polly myself, as I think we've enough boys here now." And she smiled to think of Percy and Van and Dick, her own 3 wide-awake boys. "Well, why don't you send for her?" said Mr. King. "I'm sure I don't care. I'll write myself." But Polly didn't come. A grateful, appreciative letter, expressed in Mrs. Pepper's own stiff way, plainly showed the determination of that good woman not to accept what she considered a favor for her child. In vain Mr. King stormed and fretted and begged, offering every possible advantage. Polly should have the best foundation for a musical education the city could afford. It was all no avail. Nothing broke down Mrs. Pepper's resolve until at last the old gentleman wrote one day that Jasper really depended on Polly to cheer him up. And so it was decided. Pretty soon all the town knew that Polly Pepper was going to the big city. There was only one person who doubted that this delightful chance should be grasped at once, and that one was Polly Pepper herself. "I can't," she said. "I can't just go and leave you to do all the work, Mamsie." "But don't you see, Polly," said Mrs. Pepper, "that you will help me twice as much as you could possibly here by getting a good education? Think what your music will be. Only think, Polly." And so one morning Ben put Polly and her numerous bundles on the train under the care of the conductor, and he left her sitting straight up among her parcels, her sturdy little figure drawn up to its full height. Polly had begun to realize that now she was going to help Mother. Soon they neared the big city, and everybody began to bustle around and get ready to jump out, and the train stopped, and a bright boyish figure dashed up. "Oh, Polly," said Jasper in such a ringing voice. And in another second Polly and her bag were one and all bundled out upon the platform, and the train whizzed on, and there was Mr. King fuming up and down, and turning to look down into the little rosy face beside him, he burst forth, "Bless me, child, I'm glad you're here, Polly." Like a precious parcel, Mr. King handed her into a handsome coach lined with dark green satin. Soon the coach turned in at a brownstone gateway, and winding up among some fine old trees, stopped before a large stately residence that in Polly's eyes seemed like one of the castles of Ben's famous stories. A stiff butler held the door open, and then the rest was only a pleasant, confused jumble of kind, welcoming words, till Polly herself seemed floating away fast to the fairyland of her dreams. But it was best of all when a lovely face looked down into hers, and Jasper's sister bent to kiss her. "I'm very glad you're here, little Polly." And from that moment on, Polly never ceased to love Marion Whitney. "This little girl must be very tired," said Mrs. Whitney. "Oh, no," cried little Dick, the youngest of Mrs. Whitney's three. "Why, she's just come, and we want to look at her." "For shame, Dick," said Percy, the eldest, a boy of 10 years. "She's come a great ways, and she ought to rest, you know." "You wanted her to come out to the greenhouse yourself, you know you did," put in Van, the next to Percy. "Come, dear," said Sister Marion, rising quickly and taking Polly's hand, while Jasper showed unmistakable symptoms of pitching into all the 3 boys. And on the morrow came Polly's music teacher. The big drawing room, with all its beauty and loveliness on every side, was nothing to Polly's eyes, only the room that contained the piano. Every chance she could get, Polly would steal into the drawing room, away from Jasper and the 3 boys, and laboriously work away over and over at the tedious scales and exercises that were to be stepping stones to so much that was glorious beyond. "She likes it," said Percy, in absolute astonishment one day when Polly had refused to go out driving with all the other children. "Much you know about it," said Jasper. "Why, she's perfectly aching to go, Percy Whitney." "Well, why doesn't she then?" said Percy. "Because," said Jasper, "she's commenced to learn to play, and there isn't anything going to stop her." But it must be confessed, Polly was homesick. All her imagination of her mother's hard work, increased by her absence, loomed up before her, till she was almost ready to fly home without a minute's warning. "Polly doesn't like us," said Van one day in despair. "Then, dear," said Mrs. Whitney, "you must be kinder to her than ever." But just here Mr. King thought it about time to take matters into his hands, and so with a great many chucklings and shruggings, he departed after breakfast one day, simply saying that he wouldn't be back to luncheon. Polly sat in the drawing room near the edge of twilight, practicing away. If she could only see Phronsie for just one moment. "I shall have to give up," she moaned, and over went her head on the music rack. "Where is she?" asked a voice over in front of the piano in the gathering dusk, unmistakably Mr. King's. Polly bounced up straight and whisked off her tears quickly, and up came Mr. King with an enormous bundle in his arms. "Here, Polly, hold your lap," he said, and then he broke out into a loud burst of merriment in which all the boys joined until the big room echoed with the sound. And at this the bundle opened, and out popped Phronsie. Polly couldn't speak, and if Jasper hadn't caught her just in time, she would have tumbled over backward from the stool, Phronsie and all. "Oh, Phronsie," Polly cried, and strained her to her heart, while the boys crowded around and plied her with sudden questions. "Boys," said their mother, "she can't answer you. Just look at her face." And to be sure, Polly's face was a study to behold. All its old sunniness was nothing to the joy that now transfigured it. "She is the cunningest little thing I ever saw," said Mrs. Whitney, afterward aside to Mr. King. "How did her mother ever let her go?" "Oh, she couldn't help it," cried Mr. King, beaming as he recalled his successful strategy. "I just told her it would stop Polly from ever being a musician if she didn't see Phronsie." And now nobody liked to think of the time or to look back to it when Phronsie hadn't been in the house. Phronsie's chief occupation was the entertainment and amusement of Mr. King. Nowadays no one ever saw the old gentleman going out of a morning without Phronsie by his side, and nearly all of them stopped to gaze the second time before they could convince themselves that this was really the stately old Mr. King about whom they had heard so much. "And I tell you, Marian, what I am going to do." Mr. King's voice was pitched on a higher key than usual, and extreme determination was expressed in every line of his face. He met Mrs. Whitney at the foot of the staircase, dressed for paying visits. "Oh, are you going out?" he said, glancing impatiently at her attire. "And I just started to speak to you on a matter of great importance." "Of great importance indeed," he repeated irritably. "Well, it's no matter, Father," she replied. "If it's really important, I can postpone going out for another day, and—" "Really important," repeated the old gentleman irascibly. "Haven't I told you it's of the greatest importance? Why, there's no time to be lost. It's about the Peppers." "The Peppers?" repeated Mrs. Whitney. "Yes. The fact of it is, I'm going to have them here for a visit. The whole of them, you understand. And that's all there is to it." "Will they come?" asked Mrs. Whitney. "Of course," said Mr. King. "Why, there's no other way. Pretty soon Mrs. Pepper will be sending for her children, and of course you know, Marian, we couldn't allow that. Well, that's all there is to it." And the door closed on his retreating footsteps. And so Polly and Phronsie soon knew that Mamsie and the boys were to be invited. "When are they coming?" Polly found time to ask in the general jumble. "In 3 weeks from tomorrow," said Jasper. "The whole of them, Cherry and all, will be here then." Polly chose a new and more difficult piece of music to learn. Phronsie aspired to an elaborate pincushion made of bits of worsted and canvas. And at last the day came when they could all say, "Tomorrow they'll be here." A big green welcome was over the library door, made of laurel leaves by the patient fingers of all the children. "Oh, dear," said Phronsie when evening came, "I don't intend to go to bed at all tonight, Polly." But Phronsie allowed herself to be persuaded at the proper time to be carried off and put into her little nightgown. And when Polly went up to bed, she found the little pincushion that she had insisted on taking to bed with her still tightly grasped in the fat little hand. "She'll roll over and muss it up," thought Polly. "I guess I'd better lay it on the bureau." It was going on toward the middle of the night when Phronsie, whose exciting dreams of Mamsie and the boys wouldn't let her rest quietly, woke up. And in the very first flash she thought of her cushion. "Why, where is it?" And she began to feel all around her pillow to see if it had fallen down there. "I guess I better go get it," said Phronsie to herself. And out she pattered over the soft carpet to the table at the end of the long hall. She stopped to peep over the balustrade. Just then a little faint ray of light shot up from below and met her eyes. "Why," she said, "they're all downstairs." She went slowly down, guided by the light, which, as she neared the bottom of the flight, she saw came from the library door. The soft little feet went pattering over the thick carpet until she stood just within the door, and then she stopped, perfectly still. 2 dark figures, big and powerful, were bending over something that Phronsie couldn't see. A lantern on the floor flung its rays over them as they were busily occupied. "Why, what are you doing with my grandpa's things?" The soft, clear notes fell like a thunderbolt upon the men. With a smothered cry, one of them started forward with arm uplifted. A noise came from above, a rushing sound through the hall. The 2 men sprang through the window, having no time to catch the lantern or their tools, as Polly, followed by one after another, rushed in and surrounded the child. The children, frightened at the strange noises, began to cry and scream as they came running through the halls. Jasper rushed for the men servants. And there stood Phronsie, surrounded by the pale group. "They were touching my grandpa's things, Polly." "Well, I should think they were," said Jasper, running over amongst the scattered tools and quantities of costly articles gathered ready for flight. "They've broken open your safe, Father," he cried. "What did you get up for, Phronsie?" said old Mr. King. "Bless me, somebody else ask her. I can't talk." "What did you get up for?" Mrs. Whitney asked. "Dear child, what made you get out of bed?" "Why, my pincushion," said Phronsie. "I couldn't find it, and—" But just then, without a bit of warning, Polly tumbled over in a dead faint. And then it was all confusion again. And so on the following afternoon it turned out that the Peppers, about whose coming there had been so many plans and expectations, just walked in as if they had always lived there. The greater excitement completely swallowed up the less. And so the little brown house emptied itself into the larger house with such ease that no one could remember what it was like not to have 5 little Peppers about. The great mansion rang with their merry doings and adventures. But the best time of all was the quiet time, when they, together with the 3 little Whitneys and Jasper, went to Mrs. Pepper's big sunny room and found her with her mending basket seated beside Cherry's cage. Between energetic stitches, she looked up over the busy group, the most placid expression on her face. And the 5 little Peppers and Jasper flew off into reminiscences and accounts of the funny doings of the little brown house, and Mrs. Pepper joined in heartily till the room got very merry, so much so that nobody heard Mrs. Whitney knock gently at the door. "Well," she said merrily, "you are having a nice time. May I come in and listen?" And so away they launched again. Mrs. Whitney was soon enjoying it as hugely as the children, when a heavy step sounded in the middle of the room, and a voice spoke in such a tone that everybody skipped. "Well, I should like to know what all this means. I've been all over the house, and not a trace of anybody could I find." "Oh, Father!" cried Mrs. Whitney. "Van, dear, get up and get Grandpa a chair." "No," said the old gentleman, waving him off impatiently, "I am not going to stay. My head is in very bad condition today, very bad indeed." "Oh," said Phronsie, "my poor sick man wants me." And flying out of her mother's arms, she ran up to Mr. King. "Does it ache very bad?" asked Phronsie. "It won't," said the old gentleman, "if you will only keep on taking care of it, little Phronsie." "Then," said the child, "I am going to take all care of you, Grandpa, always." "And so you shall," cried Mr. King, no less delighted than she was. "Mrs. Pepper." "Sir," said Mrs. Pepper. "We have to come to an understanding about this thing." "What is it, sir?" asked Mrs. Pepper. "Well, the fact of it is I must have somebody who will keep this house. Now, Marion, not a word," as he saw symptoms of Mrs. Whitney's joining in the conversation. "You've been good, but Mason will be coming home in the fall, and then I suppose you'll have to go with him. Now, I intend to get things into shape so that the house will be kept for us all, so that we can come or go. And how can I do it better than to have all the Peppers, you, Mrs. Pepper, and all your children, come here and live?" "Oh, Father!" cried Jasper, rushing up to him and flinging his arms around his neck. "Goodness me, Jasper!" cried his father, feeling of his throat. "How can you express your feelings so violently? Do you say yes, Mrs. Pepper?" "Why, sir," stammered Mrs. Pepper, "I don't know what to say." "To come here and live!" cried Jasper, unable to keep still any longer. "Don't you want to, Joe?" "To live!" screamed Joel. "To live!" echoed Phronsie, "in this beautiful place?" "Oh, Mamsie," that was all Polly could say. And even Ben had his arms around his mother's neck, whispering "do" into her ear, while little Davy got into her lap and teased her with all his might. "What shall I do?" cried the poor woman. "It's the very best thing you could possibly do," cried the old gentleman. "Don't you see it's for the children's advantage? Why, they'll get such educations, Mrs. Pepper, as you want for them." "If I were only sure it was for the best," said Mrs. Pepper. "Oh, dear Mrs. Pepper," said Mrs. Whitney, "can you doubt it?" "Then," said Mr. King, getting up, but still holding on to Phronsie, we'll consider it settled. This, children, is your home," he said, and waving his hand at the 5 little Peppers, he marched out of the door with Phronsie on his shoulder.